going to kick off the second part of the afternoon with David Harris, who is going to discuss Evans's time at the Institute of Archaeology, and of course David is very well placed to do this himself once holding the directorship of the Institute. So I'm looking forward to hearing his take on the matter. Thank you so much, David.
Well, I fear what I have to say will inevitably be rather an anticlimax after hearing about John's exciting life when he was a young and very active excavator, because my task is to turn to his years at the Institute, primarily in a role as teacher, supervisor and administrator. And having succeeded him when he retired, I became keenly aware of the extent to which he had very discreetly managed to steer the Institute through very difficult years and on to the notable expansion, and I think I can fairly say success, that we now enjoy. So I shall reflect briefly, try to keep to the time, on some of his achievements during and before he assumed the directorship. And knowing that John Wilkes will follow me and talk about John's roles, many roles, in the wider world of archaeology beyond the Institute. And I have permission from our chair lady to close with a brief anecdote from his earlier life. The year 1973 marks the turning point in John's life, when, in his late 40s, he became director of the Institute. The focus of his career shifted from field research in the Mediterranean, very delightful occupation, to academic administration, rather less joyful. Even before 1973, he had begun helping the then director, Peter Grimes, Peter in inverted commas, as most of you will know, to transform the Institute from a small postgraduate research institution into what would become the largest university department of archaeology in Britain. The world of professional archaeology was still very small in 1956, when John moved from Cambridge, where he held a research fellowship, to London to succeed Gordon Child as Professor of Prehistoric European Archaeology. He had not previously held any teaching post, and he immediately inherited Child's teaching responsibilities. Many of us, I think, may think of Child as primarily an extraordinarily productive researcher and writer of papers and books, but in fact he did a great deal of teaching in the Institute, perhaps more especially in his early years there. Now John, as I say, had not had any previous teaching post, and the responsibilities he inherited, and this was in his first year, meant that he had to give 120 lectures, which by the standards of the time was a very heavy load indeed. The Institute staff, which he later described as, quote, rather top-heavy, consisted then of 4 professors. You will probably all know who they were: Max Mallowan, Frederick Zoyner, Shepherd Freer, and John, supported by a small number of lecturers and assistants. I will not name them. Perhaps small is a bit unfair, but it was certainly top-heavy. At that time, most of the students took the 2-year postgraduate diploma, and a few more were registered for research degrees. There were no undergraduates. In later life, John recalled how greatly the Institute differed from the Cambridge Archaeology Department in the Institute's Wheeler-inspired emphasis on preparing students to become professional archaeologists by teaching them the practical skills of excavation, recording, analysis, and conservation. Wheeler believed that such practical training should be provided for postgraduates, and it was not the job of the Institute to offer undergraduate degrees. John didn't doubt that part of the Institute's mission was to provide practical vocational training for would-be archaeologists, but he was also convinced that the subject had much to contribute to general education at the undergraduate level. He expressed this view very clearly in his inaugural lecture as director, entitled Archaeology as Education and Profession. On that occasion, he acknowledged, perhaps somewhat wistfully, that he was now, quote, firmly classified, for good or ill, as an administrator first and an academic afterwards. John was determined, as was Peter Grimes, that the Institute should offer undergraduate degrees in archaeology, but there was widespread opposition to this in the University of London, as well as from some of the Institute's staff, and notably Kathleen Kenyon, of course, who can be formidable in her opposition. Permission to start a BA degree was refused then, and it took 10 more years of campaigning before degrees were eventually introduced in 1968 and the BSc following in 1969. Winning this campaign was John's first major administrative achievement at the Institute, and it also led to the replacement of the old postgraduate diplomas by one-year MA and MSc degrees. I like to think that John's second major achievement, initially working with Grimes, was to increase the Institute's staff by appointing new lecturers and technical and secretarial staff. This was possible from the late 50s through into the early 70s, when, before the cuts that were soon to come, universities were expanding, financial support from the University of London was relatively generous, and recruitment of undergraduates to the BA and BSc degrees was buoyant. The increases in the Institute's staff not only reinforced existing strengths, but also allowed expansion into new fields, such as Southeast Asian archaeology. It's nice to see Ian Glover here, who was appointed to take on that responsibility, and Latin American archaeology. John hoped to introduce African archaeology as well then, but this was not achieved until the 1980s, when new lectureships were also gained in archaeobotany, ceramic technology, and quantitative techniques. The expansion of the Institute's academic remit into new regions beyond Europe and Western Asia is testament to another aspect of John's vision for the future, his commitment to a world view of archaeology. This can be traced back to Wheeler with his fieldwork in India and his success in obtaining a part-time, if short-lived, professorial appointment in Indian archaeology. But John deserves great credit for increasing the Institute's involvement in archaeology worldwide, a process that has continued and accelerated since his directorship. Now, after the financial and academic optimism of John's early years at the Institute, a succession of severe cuts in funding began, just as he became director. He coped successfully with this at first, but when the Institute's core grant from the university was progressively reduced through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the situation became untenable. At one point, John was told by the university that the Institute, quote, would have to lose a member of staff each year for the foreseeable future. It was then that the idea of the Institute joining University College, which had already been envisaged, came to the forefront. John favoured the change, though not all his colleagues did, and the Provost of UCL, Sir James Lighthill, who was a member of the Institute's management committee, strongly supported it. Lengthy negotiations followed, conducted by a series of subcommittees dealing with academic, financial and technical matters, a process that culminated in 1986 when the Institute was formally incorporated into the college, an outcome that both secured the Institute's financial future, though not without difficulty, and made it easier for our students to take courses in related UCL departments. Eventually, too, after John's retirement, it led to the transfer to the Institute of UCL staff with expertise in Egyptology, Greek archaeology and medieval archaeology, which further enhanced the Institute's strength and breadth in teaching and research. There's not time today to describe the many other ways in which John contributed to Institute activities, such as his support of Primtech, which so many former students recall vividly as their first experience of the Institute's unique community spirit under canvas in this case. Also, his support, for instance, of the experimental farm of Butser in Sussex, and of archaeology abroad, the worldwide list of fieldwork opportunities that the Institute published annually. So, keeping my anecdote for the end, let me close in one sense by recalling that throughout all this administrative activity, John remained very modest about his own scholarship. I think many of his younger colleagues had very little idea of how much fieldwork he had done in his earlier years, and his unfailing consideration that he showed towards his colleagues at the Institute and elsewhere, and how he inspired and encouraged so many students to become archaeologists themselves. Now, I would like us to round this off, because when, thanks to Judith Conway letting me see a copy of a report that John wrote in Spain when he was a member of a group that toured the Balearic Islands on a tour organised by the University of Barcelona in September 1950. This comes from his report, or parts of it. John records that on arriving in Barcelona, before the party embarked for the tour of the islands, he was, quote, glad to meet Professor Hawkes of Oxford and his wife, also an archaeologist of distinction, close quotes. A reference, of course, to Jaquetta Hawkes. 2 days later, as he set off to hear Jaquetta give a lecture in the Palmer Town Hall, he was, quote, confronted by a tall man holding a small boy by the hand, who asked me, in English, where could I find the Hawks? Because, quote, there was a vague arrangement with them that they should come and visit him at his home in Dare. John soon discovered that this mysterious man was no other than Robert Graves, the writer, who had come to the wrong hotel. With his fluent Spanish, John soon sorted out the confusion, and as a result found himself, quote, to my great delight, included in the invitation. The visit occurred several days later, when, because Christopher Hawkes had to chair a lecture, Jaquetta, her 13-year-old son, and John set off without Christopher on the long journey through, quote, the magnificent country of western Mallorca to the little mountain village of Dare, where they were received a warm welcome and passed a very pleasant afternoon, bathed in the little cove beneath the house, and, Christopher having now arrived, stayed until about 8 p.m. and talked of many things. I like this story because it gives us a picture of John as a young man delighting in his new experiences, and surely, especially having read English for his first year at Cambridge, before switching to archaeology, relishing this chance encounter with one of England's famous poets. Thank you.